Hi folks, welcome to day 12. Today we're going to be learning how to factor by grouping. Alright, and this is the last big content piece before we do some review for that cumulative quiz on Friday. Alright, so what we're going to start off with is so we started this unit by learning what polynomials were, how they add, subtract, multiply, and then how to factor them, right? So we started off with easy factoring, monomials, then went on to binomials. Yesterday we learned how to factor ax squared plus bx plus c. Well, now we're going to learn how to factor four-term polynomials. So you factor four-term polynomials by grouping them. So you're going to be grouping them based on their first two and last two terms. All right. So factor by grouping, which I'm going to call FBG, factor by grouping, is only ever with four terms. So if it has more than four terms, you have to factor out a monomial. If it has less than four terms, you're going to probably try and factor either as a quadratic or factoring out the greatest common factor monomial, all right? But if it has four terms, you're going to try and do factor by grouping. So when you're doing factoring by grouping, you start off with a four-term polynomial like x squared or x cubed plus 3x squared plus 2x plus 6, all right? And then you group them. You group them into your first two terms and your last two terms. And we'll see that when we have a subtraction sign between these, we'll have to do some sign changes, but we'll do that in our next example. All right, so x cubed plus 3x squared plus 2x plus 6. The reason why we can go ahead and just pick any groups that we want is because we have all addition or all subtraction. When we have subtraction, like I said, we'll deal with some sign changes, but for the most part, you're going to group your first two and your last two. After you've grouped them, which just means you put parentheses around them, you factor out your greatest common factor of each. All right? I'm going to let you know right now that's almost always your leading coefficient and your smallest power of x. All right? So in our first half, like our left half, our leading coefficient's 1, so we'll factor out a 1, which doesn't do anything because dividing by 1 doesn't do anything. But we'll also factor out our smallest power of x, which is an x squared. All right? So we're going to factor out x squared. I'm actually going to write that in green. So we're going to factor out an x squared. All right? Which means we have our x cubed plus 3x squared, but we'll be dividing everything by x squared. All right. And for our right half, we have a leading coefficient of 2, and our smallest power of x is x to the 0 or 1, so we just factor out the 2. All right. Keeping in mind that our 2x plus 6, we have to divide each part by 2, because that's what we're factoring out. All right, so when we do that, right, so when we actually pull it out and we're doing the dividing, we have x cubed divided by x squared. Remember, your properties of exponents tell you that you have to subtract those exponents when you're dividing. So x cubed divided by x squared is equal to x cubed minus 2, right? X to the 3 minus 2. 3 minus 2 is 1, so you're left with just an x. Or you have 3 x's on top. They cancel out 2 of the x's on the bottom, so you're left with just 1x. All right? Then we have 3x squared divided by x squared, so we're left with just 3. So we have x squared times x plus 3 plus 2 times, we have 2x divided by 2, we're left with just x, plus 6 divided by 2, 6 divided by 2 is just 3. Now you'll see that when we did this, we're left with x plus 3, and x plus 3. Those factors are the same. If those factors are not the same, then you cannot factor by grouping. But since they are, we're going to have our x plus 3 because that's our factor. That's one of them, right? So we pulled that one out. Our other factor is our x squared because that was what's in front of one of them, and then the 2. All right, so those are our two factors of our polynomial x cubed plus 3x squared plus 2x plus 6. All right, so we were able to factor that down into x plus 3 times x squared plus 2. All right, so that's how you factor by grouping. So what we did is we started by putting, we had a polynomial, it had 4 terms, put parentheses around the first 2 and the last 2, then we factored out the greatest common factor of each. For our first one, that was just an x squared, second one was just a 2, so when we did that, factoring those out, left x plus 3 as our common factor between the whole polynomial. So we had our x plus 3 down here, and then x squared plus 2 was our other portion of that polynomial. All right, let's go ahead and do another example. So if we have a cubed plus 3a squared minus a minus 3, all right? So your first step when you're factoring by grouping is always put parentheses around your first 2 terms and your last 2 terms, all right? But when I put it around my last 2 terms in this case, I'm going to be pulling out this negative sign, all right? So when we pull out a -1, then we're going to be dividing each of these by -1, all right? When you divide by that -1, it changes the signs. So then we're left with x cubed plus 3a squared minus, then we have -a divided by -1 gets us positive a. We have -3 divided by -1 gets us positive 3. All right? So that's how you pull out a negative. So that's like the hard part, is remembering, hey, if you put parentheses around this, you just got to flip the signs, right? That's how I think of it, is when I put my parentheses, right? So if I were to have my parentheses here, all I have to remember is by having this minus sign out front, I have to change the sign on the inside. All right, whichever way you want to think about it. If you want to think about it formally as factoring out a -1, you can, or you can just think, oh yeah, I just got to change the sign. Either way works. All right. After you put your groups, the first 2 and the last 2, factor out any negatives if you have to. Then you're going to try and factor out that greatest common factor, which, remember, is always that leading coefficient, smallest power of x. So, or in this case, smallest power of a. So my leading coefficient in this case, we have a 1. Smallest power of a is a squared, so I'm going to factor out an a squared. Over here, I have a leading coefficient of 1, so I'll factor out a 1, which again doesn't do anything. And smallest power of a is an a to the 0, or again, just 1. So our left, or our right term, actually, our right term doesn't change at all. All right, but I am going to factor out an a squared for my left term, which, remember, just divides everything by the a squared, right? If you pull out an a squared, you're dividing everything by a squared. So we have a cubed divided by a squared gets us an a. 3a squared divided by a squared, our a squareds cancel, so we're just left with 3. And then we have minus a plus 3, right, our other factor. When we do this, we see that we have the same factor, which we should. So then we have a plus 3, right, as one of our factors. And our other factor is always our two factors that we pulled out. So we pulled out an a squared with our left term, and then remember, we pull out this -1, right? So a -1 is our second term. So anytime that you are trying to rewrite your factors, you're always going to write your factor that you should have from both. If they're not the same, it's not factorable, but these ones are the same. All right. So we have that a plus 3. And then we have our a squared minus 1, because remember, even though it's not there, technically there is a 1 times all this stuff. All right? One more step, though, because we're not completely done. If we remember back to our special products from last week, we know when we have a squared minus b squared, that's a plus b times a minus b. All right? In this case, our a squared, or our a, is equal to a, and our b is equal to 1. So we're left with a plus 3, right, from factoring by grouping. And then a squared minus 1, since we're trying to factor as much as we can, we're going to use our special products, right, because it's a perfect square minus perfect square. So I'm left with a plus 1 times a minus 1 because of our special products. That is now fully factored. All right? So go ahead, try out our factor by grouping problems. Keep in mind, you're always going to group the first 2 and the last 2. So there's going to be a couple on your assignment today that is not it's not in order, it's not in standard form, but you're still going to factor the first 2, group the first 2 and the last 2 in each problem. All right? Email me if you have any questions.